The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. Now, dare I say it, in the heart of The Dragon Reborn, by which I mean not the first two chapters. My name is Greg, and I'm excited to be here to help you navigate your way through Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 of The Dragon Reborn. That's Nightmares Walking and The Hunt Begins. And joining me, as always, in the hot, hot summer sun is Tylor. Tylor, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to get some insight into your understanding of anatomy. It is just either skin or heart. Those are the only two things as far as you are concerned. And you mentioned it is warm in Boston this week. We are both kind of dealing with it. And I always get the Zoom sweats. So I say, let's keep this efficient. Let's get through these chapters. Let's call it a good one. I think these were two solid chapters overall. What was your impression?
I think I knew from the cliffhanger last week that we were in for some action, and it did not disappoint. I will give the kind of initial comment before your summary that I thought we were a little more present in the action than we usually are. We've talked before about the tendency of Robert Jordan to kind of yada some of that. And so, these felt a little different in some ways. So I'm excited to unpack them and talk about them. I will just throw out there by way of housekeeping that we are closing in on season 2 of the television show. We were just talking in the green room about how Amazon is ramping up their production. So this is your friendly reminder, timely listeners, if you're listening to us actively week to week, that coming up in the month of August, we are dropping recap episodes for the first season of the Wheel of Time television show. So if you, like us, are looking for an excuse to draw the shades and turn on the air conditioner, maybe pop onto your Amazon Prime account or one you steal from somebody who's a chump and pays for it, and check out these episodes. And we will be doing 4 episodes of our show, each covering 2 episodes of that show. So be prepared, and we will keep plugging this as a reminder. But we're enjoying that kind of different journey, and we're trying to not cross the streams between the two journeys so that hopefully whichever way you're approaching this material, you'll be all set for it.
So I'm trying to do some ridiculously timey-wimey things here as we record podcast episodes about television episodes and then promote them in other podcast episodes recorded later but that air before. So if I'm doing this math correctly, in about 2 weeks, Friday, August 4th, you will be seeing the first of those podcast episodes about Amazon's Wheel of Time television show. So you've got 2 weeks to watch those couple of episodes, and heck, there's only 8 of them. You can watch them all and then just, catch up on our podcast whenever you have a chance. We're really excited to go on that journey with you, but I will broker no more delays in our review of Chapter 5 of The Dragon Reborn, Nightmares Walking. We begin with Perrin running out after waking up with his axe, ready to raise the alarm, but Lan and Moraine beat him to it. There are Trollocs in the camp and also a few Fades. The Shinarans immediately rise to the defense of the camp, despite the fact that most of them are not wearing anything. They have their swords, and that's all that it takes. The battle goes on. Perrin first is battling a bird-like Trolloc trying to protect Leia, the Tuatha An who joined the camp in the previous chapters. Initially, he kills a Trolloc who is attacking her, and she pities him, and he is very kind of upset about her pitying him for doing violence. And then there is a fade. He battles with it briefly. Leia tries to distract it and dies. Perrin is distraught, but then the wolves arrive. They help with the battle. They fight a number of Trollocs, and Perrin then begins participating in the battle. And it's clear that he's doing so from kind of a place of wolfiness, if you will. He's kind of losing himself in the violence and his association with the wolves. This kind of peaks when he kills another Fade along with the wolves and then begins howling, and Min kind of interrupts him, and everyone is staring at him and his howling. Lan kind of compliments his fighting and breaks up the kind of awkward tension briefly. But then Perrin basically has a conversation with Min about Leia and how it was kind of impossible. And then Mazima has a brief conversation with him. And Mazima sees kind of almost prophecy or a sign in the fact that the wolves are fighting on the side of the Dragon Reborn. At this point, Perrin goes to talk to Rand. He says, Rand says that he tried to use Sidon in the battle, but it failed other than lighting some trees on fire. And Perrin kind of basically notes that Rand is, guilty about not raising the alarm. And then Perrin says he's kind of feeling guilty about not hearing the wolves and letting them give him warning to raise the alarm. Finally, we find that Rand's wound from his battle at Tomon Head has opened up. Moraine tries to heal it as well as healing Perrin. And Rand is basically exhausted, seemingly defeated, and Lan basically gets him to keep going, but only with kind of the, exhortation that you need to keep going. The world depends on you. And that seems to be all that is keeping Rand going at the end of this chapter. So as you mentioned, I find this to be a much more involved action sequence than we've gotten so far. And then some kind of really interesting quick character notes. And I think you know which of those I'm more interested in spending time on. But I wanted to start off with your review of, as you say, kind of the first real action sequence in these books. What did you think of Robert Jordan finally writing action?
I think it was a lot of fun, and it felt in some ways earned because we've now been with the Shinarans for so long. It's like, oh, I care about more people in this crowd. Of course, I still primarily care about our main characters, and he puts the female characters, well, two of the female characters in jeopardy. I don't think Moraine is ever in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And so that was all really fun. I think again, now that I'm experiencing a little of that factor where I can now picture the Trollocs a little more easily because we've started our journey in the television show. And so I find myself kind of picturing these things a little more easily and understanding the action in that way as well. My favorite part of that section, though, is the fact that when things get wolfy, the narrator changes from saying Perrin this, Perrin that to young bull this, young bull that, which I thought was such a great choice and such a nice little touch that helped you kind of directly feel that kind of taking over, if it were. There's a temptation in me to say it's like being a werewolf, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels much more what we saw in the first book about the old blood coming out, like not losing your identity to a wolf identity, but you becoming your full self. And so that was my favorite part of the action. I thought that worked really well.
Well, and I think it fits with your description of this being the first action sequence that's really well kind of detailed and described, right? Every action sequence we've gotten so far has primarily been from the perspective of a character, mostly Rand, who doesn't entirely know what's going on, right? We've had one sword fight at the end of the last book where Rand, won based on his skill, but otherwise it's a lot of like, what's happening? Oh my God, Moraine did a thing, the battle's over. And so I think it works very well that simultaneously we're getting all of these signs of the wolf coming out and it being young bull rather than Perrin, but at the same time young bull knows how to narrate an action sequence better than any of the boys from the Two Rivers have. And I think that comes across in, this is kind of our first time having someone who is almost happy, or if not happy, at least familiar with the conflict that they are in, as opposed to, someone who is almost removing themselves from it as they go.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's how many ways to say it was fun, right? But
Yeah.
I think when we've had the kind of skip over action scenes before, I haven't necessarily missed it. I've used this analogy before, but my wife always says she stopped watching Marvel movies because it's like I don't understand what's going on. They're just punching each other, and
Yeah.
eventually one guy is still standing and the other guy's knocked down. And I think especially in books where you don't have like cool choreography to grab you or what have you. I was just on a long flight and the guy in front of me binged. I think he only made it through 3 of the John Wicks, but he might have gotten through all 4.
Ooh.
And I was just like not hearing a word, but like awe-inspired by the action of those movies. The
Yeah.
choreography is so incredible. Which is to say that, it's just a reminder that when you're in a book, I think that becomes hard to describe. You're absolutely right that this is a little stronger in its description.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I usually just kind of do what my wife does at Marvel movies, is gloss over and like, okay, who's walking away from this one and who's falling. So I didn't do that as much here, and it was certainly engaging. And then I don't know if this counts as one of your character beats, but the fact that Perrin is having trouble kind of coming back seemed
Yeah.
very significant to me as well.
Yeah, I saw 2 kind of character notes in the midst of, as you say, really fun action. You noted one of them there, right? I think the fact that Perrin is almost getting lost in Young Bull as opposed to having them kind of exist simultaneously. And he spends a decent amount of time in this chapter and a bit in the next thinking about like Elias and how does he manage to try to do this. And then the other thing that I noted was Leia, right? Obviously her death. And then also that really, I think, kind of like touching scene where she sees Perrin save her. And instead of looking grateful, she almost looks like sad for Perrin having to have done that. And I thought those 2 moments worked really well for establishing this as much as a character Perrin scene as it was an action sequence. And I think that's why it works so well on the page, because as you say, usually action doesn't work great on the page.
And I'm right in remembering, sorry, listeners, we actually have had a pretty big gap in our recording lately. I'm right in remembering that Leia's death was foretold. Min
Correct.
saw this. And so I knew when I was reading this, I'm like, well, he's not going to be able to save her. And that just brought out that classic mythological kind of trope, right? Of like, somebody is destined to die. And so in fighting against that, you kind of cause it, or,
Yeah.
you can't stop it and it almost causes it. That's not exactly what happened here, but it just felt very familiar to that kind of I don't know, is that a paradox? It's not quite a paradox, but that
Yeah.
kind of idea where you are trying so hard to fight against it that you shouldn't. It's just inevitable the way it is.
Yeah, and I think for me, what works so well about this is both the moment, as you say, where Perrin is fighting an impossible battle and he even kind of knows it. And then for me, at the end of the sequence, Min is the one who takes him out of kind of the howling and being a wolf. And then immediately Perrin tells her what happened to Leia, and her kind of resignation about it, I feel like hit me just as hard as Perrin's kind of futile fight against it. She's seen it so many times. And so that reaction, I think, really stood out to me just as much as Perrin's did in that respect. The other thing that stood out to me in kind of the immediate post-action section is Mazima and his increasing willingness to attribute anything to the Dragon Reborn, with him basically saying like, oh, the wolves are on our side. This must be the camp of the dragon, which I found kind of telling of where his mind state is, on top of obviously Perrin and Min kind of dealing with loss.
Yeah, it's funny in our modern context. I think we all probably have taught a little bit about motivated reasoning and the psychology behind those things. And in this world where conspiracy theories have run rampant all of a sudden and are really doing great harm, it's kind of unfortunate to see an example of it here, which is, when you are so devout in your belief, whatever, not necessarily a religious belief, but your political belief, your social belief, that any piece of evidence is just going to connect with it. And, what stood out about that moment you're describing is that we had previously heard that Perrin is probably a dark friend because from the White Cloaks, we heard this, because the wolves work with the dark friends. And so the wolves are of darkness. And so here you got what would have been interpreted by one group as a sign of being dark friends, and it's like, nope, it just means we're what we believe is right, and we should continue to do exactly what we're doing. And it is, it's not that that's a new feeling for the modern day at all. It's kind of a well documented old psychological force, but it's kind of screwy to think of, hey, these guys in a mountain camp who have fanatic beliefs. We have another word that we tend to use for groups like that. And maybe if we weren't on the side of these guys, we'd use that word.
Well, and I really like the contrast to the White Cloaks, right? Because it's exactly the same thing, but we want to treat it differently when it's what we call the good guys instead of what we call the bad guys. And so I think Robert Jordan is playing with that really effectively, right? When we read the prologue like 5 chapters ago, we reacted very differently to this exact same sort of logic, right? That's what Pedro Nial was doing the whole time. My last big note here is about Moraine coming through and healing everyone and kind of disrupting the Rand Perrin conversation, right? I don't have a ton of early notes about what they're talking about. It seems mostly recap from my perspective, but I think those 3 characters kind of colliding on screen, if you will, or on the page for the first time, I think was an interesting little dynamic. I'm curious what you got out of that last like third of the chapter. I don't have a lot of like big star notes, but it's kind of our recap / world building / characters smashed together that Robert Jordan has done a lot in this early section of the book.
Well, and smash them together so that we can pull them apart pretty quickly too, right? I think the most striking part to me was, I think it's Min's line. She says, Rand's off sulking and snapping at whoever comes near him. And Perrin says, don't worry about it. He'll talk to me. And I just really liked that as a character beat to remind us that, hey, these boys have been through a lot, but there's still something deep that connects them. And that, he's right is the other thing, right? It's not just that he believes that, it's that he's right. And that Rand will, as far as we can tell from, Perrin's point of view, Rand will tell him what really happened and the truth. And he confesses this idea that, he really wanted to fight, but just couldn't control his power in any way. And how, both physically raw and now emotionally raw, that has made him, it really stood out. I mean, I guess the opening of the wound is quite a literal metaphor, right? Like, he is an open wound, and it's in that moment that Perrin tries to be there. The fact that Moraine interrupts it then shows that at all moments, and now he's going to try to extend the metaphor, they're tearing his flesh in different directions. They're opening the wound. Sure. But that the problem is that he is Rand of Two Rivers and the Dragon Reborn and a channeler and the leader of an army and on and on and on.
Yeah, and I think that there were 2 things in this section that really drove that home for me. So one is when Rand's wound is open, he kind of goes on a quick conversation with Moraine about like, the prophecy says all I need to do is bleed at Shai Ghul. Can we get me there right now? And like that sort of like fatalism, I think really was like, ooh, Rand is in a different place than he was. And it's interesting. I think Robert Jordan has pulled the trick of spending 2 books making me shout, I don't want to be in Rand's head, and then suddenly has put him through enough psychologically that I want to see what changed, and now he's not letting me into his head. The other version of this that I thought worked really well is the very last moment in the chapter. At the end of the last book, Rand is considering the Shinaran serving him, and he thinks that phrase that Lan taught him, death is lighter than a feather, but duty is heavier than a mountain. And it seems like he kind of gives in to having the Shinaran serve him. And it just really stood out to me how we went from that, Rand kind of giving in to having a group of people serving him, to now only a few months later, Lan is like, pull it together. The entire world is counting on you. And for a now 19-year-old, that is a lot to put on his shoulders. And I feel like we felt the weight of that a little at the end of last book. And so we need to acknowledge how much heavier that's got to be feeling at this point. I just find Rand to be really fascinating to pick into right now, because it's the first time in the series we've gotten to consider him as a mystery instead of an open book.
I mean, ditto. And I think that is a really neat trick. it's not the same, but it feels to me a lot like Order of the Phoenix, when all of a sudden Dumbledore's ignoring Harry and you're like, no, this is supposed to be like, he's my mentor and I love him. And we hear this kind of in Harry's head, and Dumbledore has his reasons, but it feels off. And I would say that it's that same feeling that I get from this, where it's like, we were so close to Rand, and it's like he's pushing us away as he's pushing everybody else away. And you know, given what we're about to reveal in the next chapter, I feel like maybe there's some Rand POV chapters to come, but I can also see him disappearing for a chunk. Pretty cool to call the book The Dragon Reborn and then not give us much Dragon Reborn, as the case may be.
Yeah, this has always been one of my favorite tricks in this book. Is it's like, okay, we are going to begin the book by telling you this is named after Rand, and then there's just an indeterminate amount of time until we get a Rand POV, and I'm not going to reveal how long that is, but let's just say your insights may be on the right track potentially. I don't have anything else to say about chapter 5. I think it's a good move the pieces around chapter, some really solid action, but a little bit less for us to dissect sometimes when that's the case. Any last thoughts before we move on to the next chapter?
I would just again compare it to the initial Trolloc attack, both in the change in its dynamic and how our characters are prepared for such things, instead of like, oh my God, this is a giant force that's overwhelming our pastoral life. It's now like, oh, we know what these things are, we know what they want, how to fight them. It's just it's again, you know, the oldest trick in the book is put your characters in the same situation and have the differences show you how much they've grown. And I thought it was effectively done in that. So take us to chapter 6, the chapter I thought belonged in the last book, which is called The Hunt Begins.
And that's because it is actually a chapter title that is in both books. So good catch. Perrin basically ends up sleeping dreamlessly after being healed. He is completely wiped out. He comes to and has Lan tell him that Rand is gone. Mazima asks Perrin what sin they must have committed in order to cause the dragon to abandon them. Perrin basically says it wasn't a sin, and Mazima won't accept that until Perrin eventually says this is part of the dragon's plan. And then Mazima basically walks off saying, okay, he's going to spread the news of him in some places, and we must spread the news of the dragon as well. Perrin then enters Moraine's hut and immediately starts kind of challenging Moraine, saying that she was the one who caused Rand to leave and that she's putting him under too much pressure. And at this point, Moraine kind of snaps a little bit. She gets very upset in a couple of places. She basically calls out Perrin for not completely understanding the situation. We do learn that Rand has left a note. I believe Min brings this in. And the note basically says, like, I'm going, and then something about dreams. Moraine then starts asking about dreams, saying that channelers can sometimes share their dreams and different people can experience the same dream. And it turns out that both Perrin and a number of others have all been having dreams of Callandor, the crystal sword that is held at the Stone of Tyr. And at this point, Perrin basically says, well, it seems like Rand's doing the right thing. He's going to fulfill the prophecy. And Moraine is like, well, there are so many prophecies, and we're going to talk about all of the other prophecies she mentions, because even if Greg doesn't care about prophecy, I do. Then we learn a little bit very briefly about Perrin's trip through the portal stone, but we also learn quite a bit about Tyr, where we learn that channeling is outlawed, discussing the prophecy of the dragon is not allowed, and that basically no one is allowed in the Stone of Tyr. At this point, Moraine says that she can't tell Perrin everything and basically shuts down all of his challenges, saying that she knows more than she could ever convey, and so he just needs to trust her. And then Moraine reveals a couple of interesting things. One, she is sending these Shinarans away rather than having them continue with them. She is sending them to Galen. Second, she tells Min that she is not going to be traveling with them. Instead, she is going to Tar Valon to help the Amerlin. She says that only a woman can carry a message secretly to the Amerlin, and so she tells Min that she needs to be the one to go. And then as they leave, Min pulls Perrin aside and tells him he needs to know a few things, passes on a few visions that she's seen around him. And then finally, Perrin realizes that Min is interested in Rand, and we get a little bit more detail about what Min has seen about herself and Rand before finally we start the hunt. So that is a lot of description of a chapter, which is a decent amount of talking, which are often my favorite chapters. What was your takeaway here? It's slightly longer. A lot goes on here. I think there are a lot of pieces that you could pull out. So I'm curious what jumped out to you.
Oh, it's funny because we texted a little bit this week just to go over schedule. And I was like, yeah, I read the first chapter. No problem. I'll get to the second one this afternoon. And I'm going to be honest, I found myself struggling with this one. I think, circumstances in my house where I am often splitting my attention as I read and also mind a toddler or, my son's watching Pokemon. And I just certainly found myself in this chapter kind of reading and then being like, whoa, I got to back up and take that again. I got to take that again. And I always want to say that experience because I think it explains sometimes my reaction to things. But I think it's less to do with the quality of the chapter, more that just it is complex and
It's
a lot of
dense.
talking. Like you say, yeah, dense, better word for it. And it's also, as you alluded to, not my favorite type of thing where it's like I'm going to remind you of some prophecies you've heard before and give you a bunch more. And I stand by my statement that most of the time that's kind of too cute by half.
Yeah.
And, when I read something like that, my mind goes to, okay, how will that be fulfilled in a way that's literally true but unexpected in some way, right?
Yeah.
Which tends to be the game authors play with that. So I think I'm excited to hear you unpack some of them because I'm sure they will be more meaningful to me. But I struggled a little with this one.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. And most of the notes that I have in here are details, right? I found myself reading this section of the chapter being like, yeah, okay, they're going there, they're doing that. This is why they can't do this thing. This is why they can't do that thing. Oh, that's a really interesting piece. And so I don't know that I actually have any big comments on this chapter. It was fine. It was dense. It did a lot of world building, but I have a million itty bitty little things that I want to pull out because I find them fun in one way or another.
Let me grab a big one then before you get into tiny details and just say, I was really surprised by the fact that Rand was just gone, and I don't want to miss that as we start to unpack what follows. Hence my rude interruption.
No.
But I do think that was really surprising, and again, what I alluded to moments ago that I think this means I could see us being in Rand's head soon. I could also see we just it's the Dragon Reborn's book because we're all working towards he's the MacGuffin, right? We're all working towards him and we have no idea what he's up to or where he is. And so I thought that was a surprising choice. And always emphasized whenever Moraine is taken aback by something. And I think it's clear she didn't quite expect it to happen. So
yeah, and I think if we're thinking about Moraine being taken aback by things, the early section of this chapter is Mazima again. We just talked about him, so whatever, I'm skipping it. Once Perrin gets into Moraine's hut, we immediately get another immediate conversation, which I think surprises me. Perrin challenges Moraine, which is in and of itself surprising, and Moraine doesn't respond with her usual cold iciness. She almost seems more engaged and almost angry or fiery than we typically see her in this chapter. And it reminded me of one of the things, as you were describing this, one of the things that Moraine tells Perrin is this isn't the plan that I wanted. I think that Rand being on his own is basically a death wish, right? She enumerates all of the ways the Forsaken are after him and he doesn't know what's coming and he doesn't know what's ahead of him and he's going after the scariest of the prophecies and he can't always channel. And when he does, it's not what he expects. And she really directly, I think, for Moraine, who usually talks around things, she won't even say he's the Dragon Reborn in this chapter. She just keeps saying he is what he is. But she outright says, my plan was not to have him alone. And Moraine discussing her plans outright is not a thing that ever happens. So I found this to be a really interesting early section of, as you say, Moraine was shocked by Rand vanishing. And then to see her off kilter in this way is something that I really, even after, as you've said, we had a few Moraine surprises before, she usually kind of recovers and then immediately starts fighting whatever caused her to be off kilter. She can't do that this time.
And again, I'm probably just cribbing from your future notes. Lan is also off kilter, right? Because it's like, hey, do you have a message for your girlfriend? And he's like, what? No, I don't have a girlfriend. And
Yeah.
oh, wait, you all know? Like everybody knows. And so again, I don't worry as much about that secret as I do Moraine's secrets and
Yeah.
so on. But I do think it was another example of combined between those. And I would probably throw Min into this category too. Everybody who seems to be in the kind of mentor level or the adults are all off kilter and
Yeah.
not where they thought they would be. So I think that sets up a really fun book of, okay, let's get things back under control. Without us even really necessarily understanding fully what took them out of control. So,
Yeah.
all right, hit me with some of your little details that you want to pinpoint.
Yeah,
And vaguely say, remember this.
Yeah,
The horse's name was Cupcake.
I'm gonna have a bunch of things that I'm like, let me just put a pin on this, and then you supply the string and connect it to whatever you would like to. Okay, so my first one that jumped out at me was Moraine starts going, which Forsaken are loose? That is a question that she asks Perrin. And then we both get an interesting perspective of Perrin thinking about how he perceived the Forsaken as like mythical stories that his mother told him. But we also get what I always personally find fascinating is just the list of names with no context. I think you've described this before as something that Star Wars does really well, of just like dropping like, oh, the Clone Wars, and then we never hear about it again for 3 more movies. I think that works really well here, where Moraine, I don't have the exact page in front of me, so this may not go exactly right, but she's like, yeah, is it Lanfear or Ishamael or Agenor, or just like a big old list? And that to me always makes me go, oh my God, I want to know every single person on this list. So I'm curious whether any of that kind of jumped out to you as well, that kind of like Moraine just overwhelming you with words without definitions section.
Well, I'm right that Lanfear is a name we know, right? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
You made me second guess myself. So that one certainly stood out. Ishamael stood out to me as a Melville fan because it is not identical. And I know there's a biblical Ishmael. And as I'm saying that out loud, I feel like we've had that exact conversation before at some point. So I assume there was a reference to that Forsaken one in the first book somewhere.
In the television show, actually.
Oh. I mean, we haven't watched the television show. What are you talking about? It's not August yet. So though, yes, and then exactly like you said, that's good. Tip of the iceberg. I want to know those stories. It is funny where parents like, what? Those are just legends. It's like, dude, you were in the last book. Like,
yeah,
you saw the heroes come when your buddy blew the horn. Like, I don't understand why this is so shocking to you, but yes, just agreed. And I think we've talked before. My PhD is in colonial poetry, so like when it's presented as little rhymes and verse, that just kind of itches part of my brain, and I think a little bit about the ways in which poetry and storytelling functioned in my dissertation, and it's just always fun to see it functioning that way in a fantasy world.
Yeah, and I don't really have anything else to say about that other than like it works, right? It just gets me excited to get all of those things detailed in a variety of ways. And I don't have a background in colonial poetry, surprisingly enough, but I feel the same way. So that's a good sign. Then we get into the prophecy section, right? And I just need to mention a bunch of these prophecies and then get your wild, harebrained ideas about what you think they might pertain to. Okay, a few things that Moraine says she does not understand in the prophecy. She says that Rand will slay his people with the sword of peace and destroy them with the leaf. She says that he will bind the 9 moons to serve him. She says that he will heal wounds of madness and the cutting of hope. She says he will break chains and put others in chains. And they also talk briefly about the prophecy of Kalendor, the sword that is not a sword, that cannot be taken by the dragon Reborn until before the Stone of Tyr falls, but it is, of course, within the Stone of Tyr, so how could he get there without the stone falling? So we have a bunch of prophecies there. I'm sure there were even some Min prophecies we could throw in later, but let's just start with the prophecies of the dragon. Thoughts here? Anything intriguing to you? Anything exciting? Even if it's just on the like those are words I know level, because that's kind of where I get sometimes.
Yeah, so certainly some these just as a bracket on the whole thing, I will say they did feel like more familiar than the last time a lot of these come up. We've heard about the sword of Tyr, or sorry, the stone of Tyr
Yeah.
before, and the sword and this kind of paradox. Um, it feels to me like we have some clear powers about how to break rock and so on. So
Yeah.
it seems like we can find a way around some of those seemingly paradoxical lines. The one that stood out most to me is let's take them, I guess, roughly in order. Shall slay his people with the sword of peace and destroy them with the leaf. That connected to the Tuatha On, right?
Yep.
Because the way of the leaf is pacifism,
Correct.
right? So is Rand going where my head went? This is the wild
Yep.
speculating part of it. Is I was like, oh, he's going to renounce violence for a while, and in pushing all of this aside and taking the way of the leaf, perhaps he will accidentally get a huge number of his followers killed, right? Like
Right.
we know he has a grand army, and so if he's going to sit out this battle, hoping to avoid his destiny by choosing peace, I think that doesn't bode well for them.
Yeah.
I have no speculation on shall bind the 9 moons to serve him. Intriguing.
Yep.
We really haven't talked astrologically at all
I'm
about
pretty
this.
sure there's only one moon.
Oh, okay. So there you go. So then I'm sure it's something like, hey, look, these 9 Gleep Glorps have moons on their shoulders. Like they must
Yep.
be the ones or something. I'm sure Gleep Glorp is one of the monsters yet to come.
Yeah, I don't know how you pulled that out. That's an amazing guess. Good work.
And then Wounds of Madness and Cutting of Hope. The two things that came to mind. The men who channel go mad. So
Yeah.
if he finds a way to heal this so that men more widely, not just him, can channel. Cutting of Hope felt to me, could be metaphorical, but we had so much in that first confrontation where
Yeah.
he used the heron sword to cut a string. It felt something like that to me. Those were the things that came to mind. More kind of references than predictions on my part in those last couple.
And I can say no more about prophecy other than good work and or terrible job. So, solid. Actually, immediately after we come out of that paragraph, we get a really interesting note about Perrin that I think is really easy to miss here. The very next paragraph after all of those prophecies, Perrin says something like, these were as surprising to him as when he went through a portal stone and realized how tied his life was to Rand's. And we've gotten in a couple of other places, Rand obviously learned like the importance of fighting the Dark One in his trip through the portal stone. We know that Agelmar, for example, Ingtar confronted the darkness within himself when he was going through the portal stone. And so the detail that Perrin, apparently what he learned is how important Rand was to him and how important it was to be with him. I thought that was just a really fascinating detail. That's, is one sentence. So it's so easy to miss here.
Definitely missed it. So glad you're pointing it out. But what comes to mind is how Rand saw, across 5 or 6 multiverses, him always having to confront the Dark One. And so I imagine, this is again speculation, that Perrin probably saw many versions of himself and all of them deeply tied to Rand. And it seems like that is not necessarily a gleeful observation on his part.
Yeah, and actually just a quick example of that from the previous chapter that we haven't mentioned yet. When Perrin battled the Murdrail, the first one that he fought, it started that battle by basically confronting Perrin directly and saying, if you cut off one leg of the tripod, it will fall. So it seems that not only is Rand being targeted, but Perrin and presumably Mat are just as likely to be targets as Rand. So I think that kind of highlights just how tied together those two characters are. Okay, jumping forward a little bit. I just loved the moment of Perrin being like, why do you never tell us these things in advance? And Moraine's answer being, how the hell would I tell you everything I know? And that just feels accurate, right? It's something
Yeah.
that I face a lot in my classes is like I'm teaching students like, here's the simple model, and then there's 8 ways to change it when you get to more complex things. And students are always like, well, it feels like the rules are changing. And I'm like, yeah, because you're learning more rules. And I can relate to Moraine here more than I ever have when she goes off about, I just can't teach you everything all at once. That moment just worked for me. I'm curious, kind of broadly, what was your take on kind of Moraine's characterization in this chapter? Because we do see a very different Moraine than I think we have previously.
Much more harried and stressed out.
Yeah.
I think all of us have our moments of being stressed, but perhaps when we're in a marriage or a long-term relationship, it's like this felt like my wife on a bad day, and that's not making fun of her. It's just like when you care
Yeah.
about somebody and they're usually totally in control, and then a bad day throws them off. It's like, oh my gosh, like this is really bad.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's just a little bit of a wobble, right? It's not just that, yeah, look, it's continuing the metaphor, because if you're off kilter, then you start to wobble.
Yep.
And we don't see steady Moraine wobble. And this is a pretty significant wobble, and it makes me a little nervous. Because I think I've come to find her as a calming presence usually, and she's not here.
Yeah.
When she's like, yeah, you don't understand all I'm dealing with. That's
Yeah.
classic stressed out language.
And then I think for me, that actually caused me to doubt her decisions that she makes in the next section of the chapter. She decides the Shinarans will not travel with them. They're being sent to Gaelden. She decides that Min is not coming with them. She's going to go to the Amerlin and Tarvalon. And just with how kind of off center Moraine is in this section, I really kind of almost had like a hesitant reaction to those decisions, right? And part of this is just that I've gotten attached to Min in the last few chapters, so I'm sad to see her leave this group. But I think that those two decisions stood out to me as like, oh, those seem almost abrupt given how much time she's given everything else. So your thoughts on the fates of those two characters or how Moraine arrived at those decisions?
Well, I think we talked about, it felt like Min got pushed up to series regular from like recurring guest star, and
Yep.
then it was like, oh, maybe we are going to lose Min for a while here. And same as Rand, I can see some Min
Yeah.
POV chapters coming up. Those would be interesting. But it also brought to mind how when you have a character who can see the future, that can get you into some sticky narrative situations. So hey,
Yeah.
get rid of her for a while and have her come back when it's more relevant. And maybe that's why we get kind of a knowledge dump from her in
Yep.
what follows, so that we have that as we don't see her for a while.
Yeah, and now I think it's time for Greg's favorite part of every podcast, the second section of prophecy analysis. So we get a few interesting notes from Min, specifically about Perrin, and he infers these are about Perrin and his upcoming journey. He thinks Min would not tell him something that wasn't going to be important in the near future. So she sees an Aielmin in a cage, a Tuatha with a sword, a falcon and a hawk perched on his shoulders, both of them female. And she tells him to run from the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, although she does say that is not a vision, it is just good advice.
Some Lanfear there at the end, clearly seemed to me the most obvious piece of that.
Mm-hmm.
The Aiel man in the cave felt reminiscent of something we've seen in the television show, but have not seen here, so I will reserve comment on that. And then I assumed the hawk, falcon and the hawk, is that what they were?
Yeah.
Those felt the most metaphorical there. Like, two women on either side, angel and devil on your shoulders, perhaps. I don't think falcon and hawk kind of neatly fall into categories of like good bird, evil bird, but felt a little like that was more allegorical, and we'll have to see him making some choices with different competing whispering in his ear, perhaps.
Yeah, and then the one that you didn't mention, I think, is the one that stands out the most to me, which is a Tuatha with a sword. That is just like, ooh, that's a contradiction in this world. That just like, okay, something odd is going on there if that's in the vision. And then we actually get one last note of a vision, and it's one we've had hints at before, but Min actually tells us outright her interpretation of her vision of herself and Rand. She says she will love him and she will share him. And it's not new information, but it's a new take on information we've had before. I just always find Min seeing her own future to be like deeply tragic and awful for her. So I always want to dwell on it at least a little. Any last thoughts on Min's visions? Because as you say, it might be the last time we see them for a little bit.
Uh, Not really, other than, I mean, maybe you're building to this. It's her at the end who says Tar Valon is not safe. And
Yeah.
that was, to me, a really good kind of juicy note to end all this on.
Yeah.
Because there was this feeling I had immediately. It's like, oh, Min's going to be safe then. She's headed there.
Yeah.
Now, remind me, we know Egwene and Nynaeve headed that way
Yeah.
between books, right? Or at the end of the last book.
Correct.
We have not met them here, so we assume that journey is headed there and going smoothly, at least at this point. Actually, would be over because it's been a few months.
Yeah.
If they just walked and kept walking, they would essentially be there.
Exactly. I think if we look at the calculations that Rand was doing in the previous book of how long it would have taken him to walk from Carrie to Tomon Head, we can kind of flip that and figure out the reverse. It's about the length of time we've been away from them. Now, maybe it's winter, okay. Maybe it slows them down a bit, but yeah, somewhere in that range is about where we're at. They should be arriving at Tar Valon soon, I think
is Mat with them, at least as far as we knew?
He is, yes, because he's being taken to Tar Valon. He still needs to be healed of his link to the dagger.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, again, those are a whole bunch of people I care about, and now we know that place is not safe. But the vagueness of it is not safe. Is it not safe because there's corruption within the Aes Sedai, or could it be there is now a force coming that is going to overwhelm the kind of eastern defenses and start washing its way towards Tar Valon? It seems possible either way.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking about Min, there's also the question of, is it not safe in the I'm worried that there might be danger there sense, or is it not safe in the sense she has seen something that makes her know it is not safe?
Right.
Because that's always something to keep in mind with Min. She doesn't always tell you when she's seen something. So I find this, as you say, to be a pretty effective kind of cliffhanger for a character that otherwise didn't have a whole lot of tension. It was more about like the world building and character development. So I think that works pretty well. Any last thoughts before we leave these two chapters behind and look at a 3-pack for next week?
So I would just say I felt like in book 2, we spent a lot of time saying, like, get on with it. Like, it's time. Yep. Like, this is enough preamble. This is enough reminder of what happened. I don't know. I have not read ahead, but it feels to me like we just got through the preamble and like we're off now. And so to me, I found this as a really exciting pair of chapters for that reason. I'm like, okay, we did this all a lot faster. We got our brief reminders. And, you know, again, I think it felt very significant that the Tuatha On came back in the picture because it felt like we kind of left them behind. Maybe a detail we didn't hit on strongly enough in this second chapter is that dreams are infectious, that everybody's having the dream because Rand was having the dream, but then also that Loyal is immune to that. All of that felt like detail that is meaningful later, right?
Yeah.
So all of that is to say, like, I found a lot to chew on here, despite my dislike of prophecies. I really enjoyed these two chapters, and you know, again, I was just on a trip, and when my wife and I go on trips, what we do is we go to bookstores because she is manages a bookstore, and I just like buying books. And like every time I would go check out the Wheel of Time books and be like, oh, I'd like to read these faster. I'm reading them, like you know, just kind of stroking them lovingly, like I'll get to you, my friends. Or looking at Brandon Sanderson and being like, is this how I like use these energies? Do I move on to him and just do that? But all of that is just to say, like, it shows that, you know, whatever hesitation I had at the initial parts of this project, like I'm in it, and I'm very excited to see like where this is going and how this builds. I did, you know, this is not a surprise to Tylor, revealed on air, found a cool like making a Wheel of Time series, like behind the scenes that is either an edition they had in the UK that is not available here, or maybe is just something repackaged. And I picked it up. I'm like, I could read a little of this, and I thumbed quickly through the table of contents. I'm like, I can't read any of this. Like there are so many words I don't know, and like things I'm sure I want revealed in the context of these books. So
Yeah.
I have set it aside, and I will hand it to you next time I see you without it being read. So talk to us about next week.
Yeah, so next week we are actually going to be continuing in the head of Perrin, which, as far as I'm concerned, deserves like a rah-rah or some sort of cheer, because we can never spend too much time in his head. We will actually be doing 3 chapters next week, 2 of them quite short, and then the one in the middle a bit longer. So this is Chapter 7, The Way Out of the Mountains, Chapter 8, Jara, and Chapter 9, Wolf Dreams. And I know dreams is how you get Greg involved in a chapter, so we're going to have a good discussion next week.
Wolf Dreams, there's something there. All right, go ahead.
There it is.
We're doing the close.
I was 3 words away from this podcast episode being over, good sir. I'm really excited to keep going forward. As you mentioned, this book just feels a little bit more propulsive to me than the previous ones, and that forward momentum is just a really good thing for a reader. Sorry you have to wait another week in order to read these chapters, but we've got some good stuff coming next week through the glass column.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.